So I want to thank you all for coming today and say that Ask the Historians has been our monthly program on the last Friday of each month. And we have been talking about different questions that people send in to us for research or kind of topics about the things that we do in the museum. So with that, I want to hand this over to our first presenter, our Executive Director, Frank Lipo.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everybody. I appreciate you joining us today for Ask the Historians. The topic this morning that Rachel and I will be talking about is actually really close to me personally, and I think it's really an important topic in our field today, in the field of history and local history, what is often called public history, where you're trying to do history out for the general, sort of the entire world, not just for a history classroom at the high school or college level, and or even back to the elementary school. And the idea, I think, is how do you tell stories about, in our case, a community, Oak Park as a community, River Forest as a community, two together as a larger community, and our sort of role in Metro Chicago here on Chicago's West Edge. And if you go to the next slide, Rachel, is the topic of when sort of current events end and history begins. Is something that we'll be talking about this morning. Is I think these days you often see, if those of you watch some of the police and detective type shows, it's so common to say sort of rip from the headlines where there's a horrific murder or some other event that is sort of dramatized maybe 6 months later on TV on one of these shows. And it's sort of like, wow, that's kind of a little bit creepy. It's like something just happened and they're sort of already sort of interpreting it. And I think historians have always faced this. I'm going to give you a bit of personal history, why I say I started off saying it's kind of important to me. I as a student, as an undergraduate, was one of the editors of my school paper, very involved in kind of campus journalism. And for a couple of years after I got out of school, I was a reporter at a paper called the Daily Journal. It doesn't exist anymore, out in Wheaton, Illinois. And they had it back in our office, sort of in the back, some bound volumes of the newspaper going back to the 1930s. And on occasion, I'd have a chance to do some research for a story I was working on, or just out of curiosity, paging through them and saying, wow, I didn't know Wheaton had some of these things happening back in the day. And if you notice up on the screen here, we have a contemporary Wednesday journal, just from, like really just from literally ripped from the headlines that might be still on some of your coffee tables, those of you who are watching this morning live or perhaps later on YouTube. And then we have an Old Forest Leaves. Some similar topics always, stories about the schools, about parking in Oak Park, at the Oak Park Arms in this case. There's often these very sort of similar recurring stories in our local papers, because we are one community that has some of the same issues over time that just have different interpretations. So as historians, though, we get a lot of times not this direct question, but like on individual topics like, oh, why are you doing that? That's not quite history yet. Or conversely, this is such an important thing in history. Let's make sure we preserve those stories as they're happening. Some evidence of what was happening in the community. And I think the answer sort of in the field today broadly, not speaking for the whole field of history, but there's a lot of emphasis on recent history, on sort of making sure you're at least not waiting many decades or even a few years to gather some of the materials that might make it easy to tell those stories later. I think this week in the international news with us leaving Afghanistan, for instance, everyone knows that that's an important story. It's horrific in terms of the loss of a life yesterday, and obviously ongoing basis in Afghanistan. But no one would sort of argue, oh, let's wait for many years to think that's history, right? It's something that you want to gather the stories. And journalists, myself as a young man, and also just today, are kind of doing that first draft of history. So some of these things I think are particularly relevant as a local history organization. My predecessor, Carol Kelm, and others involved in the organization have been, started a program of clipping the local newspapers, saving obituaries, even as we talk more about digitizing some of these materials over time. Just the fact that they were preserved and organized so that we didn't wait to go back and try to tell these stories, that we're kind of gathering history as we go along. And I think that's really important for us to do. So next slide, please. This has really hit home to me this year on this particular topic. We, for the first time, for first annual official OPRF Juneteenth on June 19th, we prepared a new program called the Black History Bike Tour. The idea that we've been doing a lot more walking tours in recent, since we've been at the new museum locations, certainly in 2018, and also, over time, things like our house walk or our cemetery walks going back 30 years, where we're trying to kind of get the history out in the streets, out kind of in front of a gravestone, where somebody who's very interesting story is to be told at the cemetery walk each October. And preparing for this bike tour, which, by the way, I'll just say for the first time, I'll say at the end of the program too, it's on our website for those of you who haven't looked at it yet. We also have some paper copies available at OPRF Museum still. And even if you're not a big biker, if you just want to drive by these locations or even walk by them for a really long walk. What we were trying to do, I think, with this, what ended up being 16 stops, was to sort of mix some of that more recent history and also history that goes back 100 more years. And I think it's really important we do that, because some of you might still say, oh, well, it's not really history because it's so recent. And I think it's a legitimate debate on some topics, perhaps, but I think there's no doubt that if you wait and wait and wait and sort of try to say, you're almost making a judgment that you're missing the opportunity to gather some of these stories and some of these artifacts and some of these photographs until a point that it's much harder to gather them. And then you are maybe missing some holes in the story. So I think this ongoing effort that we're really doing all the time is trying to gather a lot of these stories. Maybe some things we're gathering will be less important historically down the road, but we can make that choice because at least we have some more options. So this particular story you see on the sort of front and back covers of this 16 stops I mentioned, we're up to closer to 25 possibilities. And we left off some really kind of interesting stops, I think, but just to keep it a little more manageable. And there's some really obvious places like the site of the Mount Carmel Baptist Church, we'll get to in a second, on Westgate, today's Westgate, used to be called William Street, or Dr. Percy Julian's home. But in this process, you see sort of even one site having several layers of history. I'll give you an example before we turn the slide here is those of you who are familiar with, maybe some of you are members of the First United Church. Formerly, the building was formerly the First Congregational Church. First Congregational Church merged with First Presbyterian to form First United at that site. And that site was one of the stops. It actually, the church itself is also representative of other churches and religious communities that were supportive of African-American people in the community, or that they somehow were supportive of the idea of fair housing or open housing or becoming a more racially diverse community over time. And in this, in the booklet that we developed, and we focus a little bit on the fact that that church and other churches were inviting people like Booker T. Washington or James Weldon Johnson, or other sort of prominent and important Black speakers, people who are from the academy, who are sort of professor type folks, but also writers and thinkers, including Zora Neale Hurston, and the list goes on and on. And in fact, First Congregational had a speaker series where they focused in on some racial issues. It's called the Congregational Forum. And in the 1930s, this is when OPRF's Black population was very small. Also later on, First Congregational hosted the start of the housing center, OPRF Regional Housing Center now. So there's this idea of like race and support of African-American people in the community or would-be residents as being a really important community value. Going to the next slide, I'm going to focus in on another stop more visually, is the stop of that's the West. I mentioned the Mount Carmel Baptist Church, there's that church under construction on the left. And if you look closely in the upper left of this image, you see those sort of gabled roof lines. The building on the right, there's three sort of peaks. The one on the right is today's Director Building. It's still the Director Building, built in 1898. And that remains on Lake Street. You might be familiar with it. People of a certain age talk about Katie's Country Candies, or the Dr. Martens store, or until recently, that sort of health food store. And it's right next to the new construction apartments, condos, and also the large health club. And you can see how this looked across. This is taken from today's Westgate, which was called William Street at that point. And you can see how it roughly lines up with the Director Building. But on the right, you see taken from the opposite direction, taken from sort of a little bit further north on Lake Street, looking kind of roughly from the Director Building sort of perspective, or a little bit to the west of that, looking back toward Westgate. And you see that, of course, the high rises, the mid rises, the retail construction along Lake Street, and then behind it where today's Westgate is. So it's actually really hard to understand that site historically, the modest scale of this two-story church, and the fact that the area is so different. So some of this history has changed so much that current events seem to almost, confuse things. It's hard to really kind of put yourself in that position, which is important to kind of compare and contrast, and to have a walking and a bike tour in this case, where you can kind of stand in a spot and understand it better. But then you get the blending of the old and the new. The next slide, please. Another stop. There's actually two stops associated with the artist and sculptor Geraldine McCullough, who lived in Oak Park, really, really close to the museum. On the other side of the train tracks, the other side of the Public Works facility, just south of the museum, is a building that was once a streetcar sort of generating and a plant for the CTA for the old Lake Street L, and she turned it into an artist studio. And that artist studio is sort of one of the stops on this. And we talk a little about Geraldine McCullough, how she was the chair of the art department at Dominican University. Well, actually, it was called Rosary College then, but how she, really was a nationally known, internationally known sculptor. And on the stop, we have the house and studio that she created and lived in, and had planned and built some of this art. But also, we had the Village Hall, so-called Pathfinder, was the name of this piece that she did, that is in front of Village Hall, and so it's very much a contemporary current event location. It's a place that's still there. That's sort of a more modern spot, unlike the Mount Carmel Church in the last slide that's been long gone and is a much earlier story for African American history. This is part of the Village Hall itself, moved to southeast Oak Park, moving the municipal center to both be sort of a bulwark, to be sort of a place of encouragement that the community was here to stay, and that some of the folks that maybe were thinking to be sort of part of the white flight movement out of the community would stay in the community, and also choosing an African American artist who lived in the community to do this artwork a few years after the Village Hall opened. So this idea that it's both a historic site that tells some of these stories, but also the image on the right shows, what we talk about on the bike tour, is if it's hard to read in this image, of course, on your small screen, but these are chalk slogans and writing that were put on there during one of the protests in the summer of 2020, just a year ago, a little more than a year ago. You can see, if you look closely, perhaps George Floyd's name on here, and some other names of other people, and the idea of a sort of reckoning with lack of full equality for African American folks in the United States and our own community in some ways, trying to look at this as being a very contemporary spot. It literally is kind of ripped from the headlines, that this chalk, which again was cleaned off after it was chalk, shows how this is still a relevant kind of contemporary thing. And that's actually what's so important about history and current events kind of, we trying to kind of link these together, is that things are always happening in our community and in the world that we need to tell stories about, that we need to not be sort of living too much in the past, even though we're historians and we care about history as our museum, our core mission is, it's always, these current events are always becoming history. It's sort of a process and a connection that we should not lose track of. So that's that. And if you go to the next slide, here's actually an image from this, from Juneteenth, from June 19th, 2021, when individual folks were taking this booklet and going around the community, stopping at these 16 stops. And it's still available. It's an ongoing thing. It's a PDF on our website, so we can still make some changes over time. So we hope to add and change over time as we get more information, as we think something becomes more important. So that's it. Over to you, Rachel. Thanks for your time today and your attention. And Rachel Brzezinski.
Thank you very much, Frank. I just want to thank you for talking about this topic today, because it's such an ongoing topic for our community today, talking about how we share history that is in the past that maybe hasn't been talked about as much as it should have been over time. So for my presentation today, I want to talk about things that are happening to us today. How do we sort of document things as they are happening so that we can tell a more full story down the road? So I'm talking about mostly the pandemic today. And you history-minded people know that we think of current events related to this topic as extremely historically significant. We know this even as it's happening. So I can't see you all, but I want you to raise your hands if you are tired of the term unprecedented times, because I know that's become sort of a buzzword, but we have to accept that it's true. And as history people, we know that we should be documenting this time and the things that are happening to us to preserve and hopefully tell accurate and honest stories in the future. So my question that I'm focusing on today is, how do we do that? This question came up in the context of a recent donation that we got from the Village of Oak Park. Kara Pavlicek, who recently stepped away from the Oak Park, from her position as village manager of Oak Park, contacted us and said that she had been keeping some things related to the pandemic, which the Historical Society has also been doing, and I'm sure a lot of you people have been doing in one way or another. So she was kind enough to give us some things that she had been keeping. And this donation included a face mask sporting the village logo and documents and copies of things related to village mandates and proclamations, as well as a bunch of beautiful photos that were taken by Joe Kreml, who is the village videographer. You can see one of the examples on your screen here that he took. The one that you see was labeled 12/17/2020. And to me, that's sort of a funny thing to be able to look at and say, I know that must have been the date that they got one of the earliest shipments of vaccines. But how do I know that? Because I'm here? Because it happened recently enough that I can sort of put that together? Is that even true? We can sort of speculate and keep track of some of these things as they're happening, so that in the future, we will know for sure what that date means to Oak Park. So that's why some of this stuff is really exciting to look through, including the most exciting thing for me, the thing that I've been feeling very cool for having in the museum, is a collection of empty vials from Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. So we have a bunch of those as artifacts now. So looking through all of these things has made me wonder once again how we are capturing this unprecedented time. We start off with sort of the obvious stuff. And here I will show you a legal or official document from the village, which seems to us as, again, as history people and people who have done research, that is definitely one thing that you know to look for when you're researching times past. It already seems historic. So we have here the agenda for the meeting where the Oak Park officials declared a public health emergency, which was March 13th, 2020. And some of you might even remember that day. It was Friday the 13th. And for many of us, it's when our quarantine journey began. But memory sure is a funny thing, especially these days, because I have trouble remembering a lot of things. And it's even harder when you're trying to remember something that you weren't trying to remember in the first place, if you know what I mean. So capturing these stories and these little tidbits becomes more important over time. Many of us have experienced a lot of things that maybe we don't want to remember, or things that we can push aside and say, it's happened to us, but it's over. But we have to wonder what sorts of moments will be important for future generations to know. Even the little things. So this on your screen is something else that I found in this donation. If any of you had these in your window last Halloween, this is one of the more miscellaneous things that came in from this donation. And it's a similar item of things that people have given to us to sort of keep track of things that have been happening during the pandemic. But for those of you who used these in your windows last Halloween, you might not even be able to tell what kind of a story it shows of the human side of all of this that is happening to us during this pandemic. So our shared experience becomes really important to think about, especially using these little maybe artifacts or these little bits of story that tell the much broader story of what we as people are going through in this unprecedented time. So these are just some sorts of things to think about, maybe as you are trying to document your own history, your own story and experience of the pandemic, and things that you might want to think about donating to the museum, because we are always taking, and I'm sure forevermore we will be taking donations and stories related to this time that we're living in. So I want to finish off today by reminding everybody that, well, maybe as a reminder, or maybe as a new piece of information, we as the Historical Society, and very much thanks to our board member, Fran Kneckel, last May, June, we developed a survey that's available on our website with questions and prompts that can sort of help you capture your own story of living in history, living in this time period. And what are some of the things that you know to be historic, and what are some of the things that have happened in your day-to-day life that might be useful to remember even a year from now, or especially 50 and 100 years from now. So I invite you all to take a look at that on our website. And I think for this survey and for the Black History Bike Tour, I will probably just send you all on the call a link to those today. And for those of you watching on YouTube, I'm going to put that in the description so that you can check it out if you haven't already. And even if you have filled out this survey a year ago, it might be interesting to see how things have changed within that year. So that is all for me for today. So if anybody has some specific questions that you'd like to ask here at the end of the call, we have a couple of minutes for Frank or for me. And if you have any other thoughts to share afterwards, you can email me at the email on your screen. So that has been a lot to talk about today, and some very thoughtful topics to cover. So I will let you all, again, if you have any questions to share or things that you think we should be talking about in the context of these topics, then let me know in the chat box here. I can also remind everybody to take a look at our website for some upcoming events. We are actually planning a few in-person presentations at the museum coming up in September and October. We're very much keeping an eye on public health regarding what that might look like, but as of now, we are planning to have these presentations inside the museum. So take a look out for those. There's one September 11th on, we're going to have David Wilson, who is a train expert in layman's terms. He has written a new book about the Garfield Blue Line. So he's going to be talking about that. And September 18th, we have Emily Lucchese, who has written a book called Ugly Prey. Some of you might have read it because it was a pretty popular book that came out a couple of years ago about a local female lawyer who had a very high profile case in Chicago. So that's just a couple of things coming up in the next month. And I really hope to be able to see you all here if you are interested. And that being said, I think we don't have any questions in particular today. So, and unless Frank has anything else to add for today, I think I will sign off for now and invite you to check us out next time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.